Hi, my name is Melissa Gragg, and I'm a financial mediator with valuationmediation.com. I am going to talk a little bit today about divorce financial mediation and how do you create a settlement offer. It seemed to be the biggest question that people have is, I'm in a divorce process or litigation and I have the option of doing mediation. And so they all have all these questions about like, how do I choose the right mediator? Can I make an offer? So one of the things that we offer is mediation consulting. And that's really a process where we come in and we take a look at everything in your case, including the business valuations, whether you've already had a report done or if you don't have enough information. And so this should cover some of the big questions that people have and whether or not you need a consultant to help you get prepared for mediation. Our answer is always that you need a consultant or to prepare at least a couple weeks in advance. But again, you may have a team involved. And so you have to talk to your attorney or the team members and discuss what the strategy is. So in the valuationmediation.com world, we have a couple different ways of going about this. We have a training process, which you can actually sort of go about creating your own property statement, your own analysis of income and expenses, and really get towards a settlement offer that you could present either to your spouse or prior to the mediation. So sometimes mediation and litigation are just one ways that you move through the process. If you want to come with your spouse and just work with us without attorneys, you can certainly do that as well. Typically, that's going to involve a business valuation or some complex financial matter that we also need to prepare in advance for that analysis. So, when do you typically need a valuation and a mediation? I would say before you get involved in the mediation. So once you set that appointment for a mediator and you have 4 to 6 to 8 weeks until you meet with them, that may or may not be enough time to get a valuation done. And so a lot of times you really need to prepare in advance. If you don't have that valuation number going into mediation, it could mean that you're not going to get settled. It could mean that that could be the second mediation or the third mediation. So in the mediation process, you can't think that just one time that you meet is going to get everything solved unless you come in with a settlement offer at the very beginning. Then you're telling everybody exactly what you want, exactly the way to settle your entire situation. And that's financial, that could be parenting plans, it could be assuming mortgages, it could be transferring businesses, it could be splitting retirement accounts. And so a settlement offer is really the entire plan. Evaluation is one piece of that puzzle, but it's typically the piece of the puzzle that nobody agrees to, and or it's the harder piece. With a house, you can kind of talk through and say, well, maybe I think it's 320, maybe I think it's 340. With a business valuation, it could be zero, it could be millions. And when you have a spread that wide, how is anybody going to just agree to it? Is it okay to just average that number? Probably not. So, one of the things that we do is we look at a preliminary business valuation. And so, what does that mean? It means that we're going to look at 3 to 5 years of data. It means we're going to pull market comps. That means what has other companies sold for in your area or around the country, and what are the market multiples? A market multiple could be a multiple of revenue. Not all companies are valued on a market multiple of revenue, which means you basically take your revenue and multiply it by a number. For telecom companies, for example, that number could be 1 or 1.5 or 7 times revenue. Yeah, so that becomes a really important number to know depending upon who you are in this process. And so, regardless of whether you're keeping the business or not keeping the business, knowing a fair or reasonable number for that, what is fair market value of the company, is going to be pretty important if you want to get settled. So, if you want to go into mediation and not be settled by the end, then you would just stop and not do evaluation. So typically what happens though is the business owner should or could get the valuation very easily. They have all the information, they have all the financial records, and they could provide it to a valuation expert. A lot of times they think they know the value of the business, and mostly their value is typically higher than what the fair market value is. unless they're getting divorced, and then they think the value is worth zero. So what can you do if you're sort of the spouse that's not in control of those financials? You can either work with somebody together, like a joint expert where you're both hiring them, and we do that, or you can hire somebody to give you a preliminary business valuation. And what does that mean? It just means it's more simple. It's just taking a look at some of the financials, comparing it to the market, and then coming up with a reasonable estimate of the value. The reason why you're doing that is to anchor that value. You need to put forth an offer or a number that then can be discussed, because the reality is the business owner is probably going to want it to be closer to zero. So there's no motive for them to actually provide you with a reasonable number or hire somebody to do that. So in your situation, it's going to be best to find somebody that's a little bit cheaper. And this valuation process means you're not going to get a report. You might not even get anything in writing, which also protects you in some capacity. But you may want that valuation expert to come in to the mediation and help you negotiate. So those are some of the things that we look for in this preliminary business valuation, or what we like to call a reality check. And it gives everybody a starting point for the value. And then you can go into mediation and have a bigger discussion about what you think the true value is, or what your spouse thinks the value is. And now you have a range of value to negotiate within. So it's pretty important that you can sort of put over an offer that has a valuation number to it if you own any businesses. If you own multiple businesses, sometimes those businesses all operate together somewhat. So again, you're having somebody come in and look at it and say, what would be a reasonable range of value or a value for you to use in mediation? And then if they disagree or they need further clarification, you can take it one step further and maybe encourage the mediator to suggest that both of you pay for the actual report or a presentation by the business valuation expert. A lot of times when people go into mediation, their initial question, and this could be mediation or arbitration, but their initial question is like, who do I select as a mediator? And is that important? A lot of times, the selection of a mediator could be important depending upon where you are, depending upon if you're working with attorneys in mediation. It depends on if you really need somebody to help guide your narcissistic spouse into listening or being somewhat reasonable. So that the mediator's personality could come into it, but also, do they understand finances? Do they have a background in business valuations or understand the nuances when you have two business valuations presented? What if both of you hire somebody to present a valuation and now the mediator has to figure out who's right? Well, if they don't have any financial background, then they may have no clue of how to figure that out other than saying, well, let's just average the two numbers. Anybody can do that. So you want to find somebody that maybe has a little bit more understanding of the complexities of the financial picture, and that's going to be a better mediator. Reality is the mediator is just the pawn, and they are the person that you're just pushing forth your settlement offer to, and you're reasonably having them go to the other side and understand why the other side is not agreeing to your offer. A lot of times they're not going to agree to an offer because there's separate assets, there's marital waste, there's spending on a girlfriend or a boyfriend. All of those things are going to create sort of complexities in the negotiation of that particular divorce. But does it really matter about the mediator? If your spouse really wants a certain mediator, if you plan in advance and you work with a consultant to understand what your strategy is, the mediator is not as important as the strategy. The strategy and keeping your whole team understanding the strategy and the negotiation process is going to be more important than the mediator. Again, the mediator is just sort of a referee, and they're going back and forth between you and your spouse trying to get you to agree. So, what are some of the benefits of hiring a mediation consultant? Well, the reality is, if you're watching this video right now and nobody has talked to you about preparing for mediation weeks in advance and having a strategy of not only how you communicate with your attorney, but how you communicate with your expert. If All they're asking is like, what's your lowest number and what will you take? That's not a negotiation strategy. That's actually going to get you a lot less than you ever planned. And so, a lot of times when we're being hired as mediation consultants, we're developing a settlement offer that's going to anchor that deal. We're going to anchor that settlement offer in everybody's heads and minds and have them work off that offer. So, what does that mean? Well, if your spouse thinks that the business is worth zero and I come in and say it's worth a million, now everybody is negotiating off of the $1 million number because you have a valuation, because you have a preliminary valuation or an expert. If your spouse doesn't have an expert and they're just making up that they don't think it's really worth much, the mediator's not going to take that as information that is helpful. And they're going to revert back to your number. You're anchoring that number in their minds. And now everybody is negotiating off of your $1 million number. That's going to be one of the tactics we use, but also it's about negotiation and not necessarily telling the bottom line to the mediator. So, how are you using that mediator to really parlay your settlement offer to the other side? And mediation should be your first time that you are presenting your entire case to an outside party. A lot of times, mediators could be former judges or lawyers, and they have a perspective of the court situation. And so, what you're doing is kind of giving them a scenario of a settlement offer that you believe is reasonable and seeing what they say, seeing what the other side says so that you can be better prepared in court if you have to go. But reality is, if you're really prepared going in with a full settlement offer, a plan on how to settle and be done with it, you have a greater likelihood of leaving that mediation settled. If you have no numbers, odds are you're going to walk away with no deal. So, what is the timeline for preparing for a mediation? I would say first, you might need a couple months to get the business valuation done. A lot of times, a preliminary business valuation could be done in maybe 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, but you have to work with the right person. You have to ask the right questions. What is that fee for that? That fee could be anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000. And that's just to prepare that business valuation. So, are you working with somebody that could give you a preliminary value on the lower side or even less than that $5,000? You're going to have to ask them some questions. And is it worth it to just find some low cost person if they can't support that valuation in the mediation or to the mediator? So the timeline is also getting everybody on the same page, which means if you have a team that includes a lawyer or other specialists or a parenting plan coordinator or a GAL or any of these other people, then you need to make sure that you have your ducks in a row, that you know your numbers, that you know what the offer is, and you're going in with a clear mind and less emotional about the numbers. And so we usually start with a outline and a summary of the salient points of the mediation and then our top 3 issues. It's followed by a full settlement offer and how everything would be split, including a full parenting plan. So if you're not preparing all of that going into mediation, the odds are it's going to take a ton of time in mediation. And realistically, divorce mediation isn't a one time and you're done. Okay. It could be a series of mediations over several weeks. And so this process means the more prepared you are at the first mediation, then the more likelihood that you could get settled and not give them time to then negotiate with you over several mediations. So, one of the additional questions that people have is, can you make an offer if you don't have all the financial information? A lot of times, business valuation people want everything before they can put out a number. And quite frankly, it's just not necessary. A good business valuation expert, I have about 20 years under my belt. We can look at numbers very quickly. We can look at the financials. We might be able to look at one tax return and make some assumptions. You might know that some money is missing and you're saying, you know what, show me where the money went. All of those things can make a mediation successful, even if you don't settle. If you go in and you need documents, If you go in and you have questions or there's missing money and you force them to prove to you where the money is, all of that is going to be a successful outcome in mediation. The reality is you're going to have to make some assumptions. And if you don't work with experts that can do that, then you're going to have them say, oh, sorry, I can't do anything without all the information. And if you're divorcing a toxic spouse, you're never going to have all the information. So you have to make some things up based on the reality of the documents that you have. Use the documents against them. If they provided you with some part of the picture, then elaborate more and then have them tell you that you're wrong by producing the information that shows you what the real picture is. So again, just a strategy that we use and when we're prepping for mediation. So, how should somebody prepare for the valuation mediation process? You need to get together a lot of your documents. So, prior tax returns, bank statements, what has been subpoenaed. What if you're starting out and you haven't even filed? Well, this is a great place to start in our process because you really don't need to start fighting in court if there could be a settlement offer that's put forth before you even file. Maybe you and your spouse can talk about some of these things, but you need somebody in the middle to really have a rational discussion. So that's where we come in and we walk you through putting together the settlement offer, putting together a property statement, discussing the property statement, discussing all of the values in a very cohesive format. A lot of times this could take several mediation meetings, but our mediations are typically only 90 minutes to 2 hours. A lot of times a 4 hour or 6 hour or 8 hour day talking about financials is just a little bit too much. So we structure it maybe once a week or once every other week, and we go for several sessions depending upon the complexity of what's involved. We also would provide you with preliminary valuations, and all of these services are kind of a la carte. So if you need them, you can work with one of our parenting specialists and you can come up with a full parenting plan. All of these things are necessary for you to get settled in any mediation, or if you want to deal with your spouse directly and do it outside of mediation and litigation. So, what is the ideal person for this process? It could be anyone. Ideally, working together is going to save you the most time and money. And I know that people think that you can't mediate with a toxic spouse or a narcissist or a business owner, but that's just not true. For the most part, both of you probably want a reasonable, fair settlement. And when you work together and you get the information from one person or one expert, and you work with a joint expert, a lot of times that's going to save you money. Because the reality is, do you want to spend money and hire two experts that are now going to fight, or two attorneys that are now going to fight about all of these financial issues? And the attorneys don't typically understand the financial issues. So they need the experts in the room. So now you have four people in the room that are discussing this, and then you hire a mediator. What if both of you could just come and talk to somebody about the valuation and about some of these big issues like, well, what happened if they lost that cryptocurrency? Or what happened with this $1 million that went missing? Those are things that we can maybe get the information from the other party in a little bit more rational way. So if you have any additional questions or you want to work with us in some capacity, you can reach out to us. Here's my email address, and valuationmediation.com gets you started. If you think you can do some of this on your own, we have an entire training package. It's typically under $500. And if you DM us, we can probably give you a code for a discount. But the reality is, you can do some of this on your own, and it will save you time and money if you do some of it on your own or if you work together. Again, not everybody thinks it's possible, but if you think it's possible and you and your spouse are willing to give it a try, it's a good first step to try to understand what the business is worth, what your big financial issues are, and is there an option that works for you as opposed to going to a judge and having them determine your life going forward.